about this, right? So let's speak with an expert who's used coding suggestions in practice. Cal, come on up. All right, awesome. Welcome, Cal. Great to have you join us today. Before we jump in, could you tell folks about yourself and your firm?
Yeah, so hey everybody, Cal Yeaman, project attorney at Orrick Analytics. Combination of working with tech, innovation, e-discovery, really. Specific conversation today, generative AI, right?
Yeah, so I just want to thank you for all the feedback you and the team gave us. Orrick has been really, really helpful in building a great tool through the beta program. So I'm excited to chat a bit about how you use coding suggestions on an active matter. So could you provide some context for the case, how many documents, what you were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so I was brought in to help our IP litigation team support on a patent infringement claim. Traditionally, these matters are really difficult to work with a managed review because you need a dual set of expertise, right? You need to have the knowledge for the underlying subject matter in addition to the knowledge for managing the review, right? So frequently what that means is these cases end up being more expensive because you have increased QC time or you have increased time with the managing associate on the matter, right? So increased billables. After several meet and confers and back and forth, you ended up with a population, in this case, something around 10,500 documents, right? So what I wanted to do here on this particular case was do a combination review of predictive coding and generative AI to try and work one against the other to the benefit, right? The idea being that the floor for the case would be utilizing the generative AI tools to speed up the sampling process for predictive coding. The ceiling being that you can use the predictive coding to backbone and validate the work of the generative AI.
Yeah, so tell us more about the approach and the process you took.
Yeah, so I think to back up a little bit, it's helpful to frame the culture of the firm a little bit, right? Orrick is pretty tech forward and innovation forward. We have a long history for it, from our hackathons, investment and involvement with Altaclaro. It sort of is part of the culture of the firm, right? As generative AI, ChatGPT started really hitting the scene, our associates were encouraged to write limericks, to ask how many R's are in strawberry, right? These kinds of questions. We waited and assessed and analyzed, and as soon as these tools were ready to be used on client matters, we jumped in. Everlaw was no exception to that. I think that's true, though, of not just Orrick, but many people in the industry. That's true of what we did with TAR 1.0, TAR 2.0, email threading. This is just the latest iteration of that, right? So I think what's critical in that is choosing which tools to assess and analyze and work with and having a partner that you can work with, right? I think in that respect, Orrick and Everlaw have good culture value and a good fit in that way. So to back up, to zero in on getting back concretely to the matter, when you set up a traditional predictive coding model, right, in Everlaw, you have a 200 document sample, 50 documents that are relevant, 50 documents that are not relevant, and that seeds a predictive coding model that is continuously updated as you go, right? In a generative AI review, I think you just went over some of the basics of how that might work. What I did in this case is I supplanted the 200 document sample for the predictive coding model with a 95.5 stat sample based on the size of the case, okay? And then that was the validation richness sample for the generative AI. That was also the seed sample for predictive coding model. I also created essentially a TAR model in the workspace by using a static coding tag pegged to the coding suggestions for the generative AI. So to the extent the generative AI contrasted in the initial stages with the assessment of the managing associate or the partner, that static tag allowed us to track drift between the two models. So as we coded the prompt suggestions for the models, right, I ran 250 document microsamples to start with to cite in or zero in the coding suggestions. And that's a really critical key point. This is a much more organic and iterative process than a traditional tar case would be, right? So you're going to need to do that multiple times. I'd highly encourage people using these tools to do so in a small sample set, particularly if you get into the documents a little bit early, sort of look around and see what you're working with and identify certain specific documents to iterate on so that you know what you're working with, right? After that, we ran our 95.5 richness sample. We assessed that. Once our case team was comfortable with the nature of the coding suggestions and that they were accurately returning what we wanted, we applied those coding suggestions on that sample set and then ran the coding suggestions over the larger review set. We then ran two 95.5 sample sets for the two different predictive coding models, the static tar set and then the predictive coding model for just the regular Cal. We then finally ran our privilege screens. QC, one of the QCs that I did, and I would encourage everybody to do the same, would be the contrast and comparison between the coding suggestions and also the ranking scores of the two different models.
So I know you expressed some perfectly reasonable skepticism coming in about, hey, could this do as well as first pass reviewer person? Tell us more about the outcomes, both the objective measurements and the subjective experience of using the tool.
Yeah, so I was a little skeptical going in, right?
Right, totally.
I wondered whether or not the tool could keep up with sort of the analysis or level of nuance of a human, or whether or not it could be as consistent as predictive coding. I was surprised to find that the generative AI coding suggestions were more accurate than human review by a statistically significant margin. That's going to vary from matter to matter, I think. That's going to depend on the criteria of your review, the nature of your case, the subject matter underneath. The more subject matter expertise is required, the more it's going to favor something like the generative AI model. The more linear the analysis is in nature, even if complex, the more it's going to benefit the generative AI model. The more sort of squishy or nuanced the analysis is, if this then that, but not this and that, right? That's going to make it difficult for the model to assess. But to be fair, that's also difficult for first level review, and that increases QC, right? So objectively though, a key factor that came up during the course of this review was the consistency of the model. If it was consistently right, it was right the whole way through. If it was wrong, it was consistently wrong the whole way through, right? So that reduced the QC on the back end. Subjectively, I think that it was easier to run a generative AI case in the sort of targeted small scale review with managing associate, partner, myself, than it would be to run predictive coding, because there's much more nuance and reasoning with the assessment of the tools. Also, you have the coding suggestions, the document summaries. It allowed us to much more quickly assess the sampling of the population. It sped up how quickly we're able to get that done. And once you get to that point, I mean, instead of working, let's say it's a 95.2 sample and you're working, 1,200 documents, 1,500 documents, or whatever it is for your population. Instead of having managing associate wasting their billable hour time working through that sample with their subject matter expertise, right, document by document, this is garbage, this is gold. You have somebody instead using their critical analysis over documents that are already assessed, getting it done in a fraction of the time, and then giving you the information you need to be able to assess the population properly. And that's really something that's important too, is that generative AI work product, 2, 3, 4 minutes tops, right? We had the 10,500 document population was 2 tranches of review. The second tranche of review, by the time I got done, including privilege analysis, 3 hours, right? And that was 4,000 documents, 5,000 documents. So that was pretty great.
Yeah, great work.
So, I mean, the bottom line, right? Much as with prior technological advances, new tools bring new efficiencies, right? That's what we were just talking about. Raw linear review is less efficient than threaded email review, is less efficient than tar, is less efficient than Cal, right? This is the same next step in my personal view. So what does that mean for this particular review? Let's assume when I'm saying review for, like a managed human review, we're talking about an optimized review. It's been threaded, you've had search terms applied, you've had near duplicate analysis, you've had it ranked for richness and associated and sorted, right? But you're not doing a cutoff, a prioritized review, right? I ran the numbers. Let's say you're being inefficient with the generative AI and you're running it across the entirety of the population and you're running it 4 or 5 times at cost, right? I mean, it was less than half the cost of what it would have been for a managed review for our rates. It was less than 20% of what it would have cost if I was to do it on sort of a targeted basis with me. It was less than 5% of what it would have cost with a managing associate. And recall, this was an IP litigation case where you need the subject matter expertise of the managing associate. So it was a massive savings to the client. So, I mean, I think something else that's really important is how accurate we found the model to be.
Definitely.
I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how cheap it is if it can't do the job, right? Of all the documents that were suggested to be not relevant by the model, there was a single document that the managing partner on the case decided was relevant. That document was a lesser inclusive email that was otherwise wholly represented in the production population, right? I thought that was pretty solid. Something else I thought was highly impressive was the privilege. This is where I thought the model was going to be the weakest. In this particular case, the managing partner on the case was one of the relationship partners for the client, and there were 2 partners. And the underlying subject matter, there was an email sent by a relationship partner to the client. The client responded, right? Partner's name is Joe. So the client said, hey, Joe, blah, 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 patent 123, right? It's all about patents. They're talking about patents all the time. Sometimes that's privileged internally to the client. Sometimes it's not. The client copied that response, lifted it into a new email, and pasted it internally, right? There's no indication that that was an email to an attorney. There's no indication that's necessarily privileged, nothing in the metadata, no nothing. The only reason we knew that it was privileged was the partner on the case for the e-discovery portion happened to be on the original chain. So we're like, hey, red flag, we got to figure this out, right? So I crafted a generative prompt as part of the regular privilege tag to try and catch the first name analysis. No dice, didn't work at all. Maybe 15, 20% of the time it hit. I took that out and I did that as a novel tag and it hit everything. It hit the emails, memos, board meeting minutes, whatever. Not only that, it caught outside counsels we weren't aware of, their first names. It caught Orrick attorneys who moved to other outside counsel firms and were like, hey guys, I don't represent you anymore, blah, blah, blah. We were finding things in our final privilege screen analysis that the model had already caught at the beginning of the review.
That's wild. Any other observations or trends you saw?
Yeah, I think something that I thought was really interesting is for the majority of documents, majority of the time, everything was really closely aligned. I'd say the predictive coding models and the coding suggestions were within 5 to 10% of each other. The ranking suggestions were within 5 to 10%. Some of them sharply contrasted. Some of that, I think, came down to the initial sampling where the model suggested X, the managing partner or the managing associate said, no, it's Y, right? And then we had that static coding drift that I talked about at the beginning. And that makes sense. However, there was also some sharp contrast between the generative AI coding suggestions and the machine learning models, both of them. Every single time there was a sharp contrast between those two, let's say the documents were ranked incredibly low by the machine learning models, but it ranked high and suggested as relevant by the coding suggestions. 10 times out of 10, the partner assessing it or the managing associate assessing it said that document's relevant. So there's something, and those documents tended to be something that needed some sort of heuristic reasoning, right? You need some sort of nuance to the reasoning. And I don't know the exact gummings of how that works, but it reasons a little bit more like a human would in terms of like how it appears. So my takeaway from that is that it's a double-edged sword, and it's a very powerful tool. It's a good example of garbage in, garbage out. And you need to make sure that your coding criteria is tight and is not too nuanced, because otherwise you're going to get strong drift that's going to be hard to correct for.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Can you, I mean, you've gone through this process now. Do you mind sharing any just retrospective lessons learned about that you share with other people if they're going on this journey here?
Yeah, 100%. If you're starting down this road, I would start with experimenting on the data from a closed matter, but I would not pick a simple matter. I would pick a complex or rich matter. And what do I mean when I say that? I mean something that has varied document types and extensions. So, metadata-wise, a complex matter, but also substantive content-wise, a complex matter. When we started experimenting, we had a very cut and dry case that was just nothing but contracts, and we didn't get a lot of good usable information on that first case. We didn't start getting great information and learnings and wisdom or whatever until we started experimenting with more different varied kinds of cases. Definitely spend a little time just poking around and getting to know your document population before you start microsampling or crafting your prompt generation. Pick and identify certain documents to seed into that sample. That way you know certain target documents to ID and to iterate upon. On that point, microsampling. You need to do that before you start doing your statistical sampling for richness, illusion, null set, what have you. The microsampling is key. This is an iterative, organic kind of process as compared to TAR 1.0 or CAL. And then I would also try and utilize different kinds of different kinds of issue analysis, right? So relevance, privilege, hot or key, some sort of semantic analysis, right? Give it different kinds of things to analyze in different kinds of ways and try and break it, right? See how it works, see how it doesn't work, where does it stand up, where does it fall down, and then try and figure out why.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate the insight, Cal. All righty.